Before the Civil War, Harpers Ferry was an air-polluted, noise-polluted, busy industrial town, all built up around a United States gun factory. 3,000 people lived and worked here. 300 of them were African Americans. 150 were slaves, and 150 were free blacks. Isaac Gilbert was one of the slaves. Gilbert must have had a skill. Evidence suggests that he may have worked for the railroad. We do know that Isaac Gilbert earned more than $110 a year. We know this because Gilbert convinced his owner, Susan Harding, to let him buy his own time. As long as Gilbert paid his owner $110 a year, his time and whatever extra money he made was his own. By Christmas Eve, 1858, Gilbert had $1,400 in gold. Isaac wanted to use the money to buy the freedom of his wife and 3 children. They were owned by another master. But property cannot own property. Virginia law held that because Isaac Gilbert was a slave, he could not own other slaves. Gilbert got around the problem. He went to the town's mayor, Fontaine Beckham. Beckham agreed to purchase Gilbert's family and turn the bill of sale over to Isaac as soon as Isaac could buy his own freedom. This makes Beckham seem like a pretty decent fellow, until you realize that he probably bought and sold more slaves than anyone else in town. Beckham must have liked Gilbert, because he took out a will that stipulated that if he died before Isaac was free, Isaac's wife and children were to be emancipated. In October 1859, John Brown came to Harpers Ferry and tried to start a slave rebellion. He failed. 4 townspeople were killed in the fighting. Mayor Fontaine Beckham was one of them. When he died, Sarah Gilbert and the children were no longer slaves. They were the only people directly freed by John Brown's raid. It's ironic that Fontaine Beckham's will, the document so important to the Gilbert family, closes directly against the last will and testament of John Brown in Jefferson County Will Book 15. After we discovered this much of Isaac Gilbert's story, we were pretty anxious to find out if Isaac and the rest of the family were ever able to be together. Freedmen's Bureau records revealed that Isaac worked for the United States Quartermaster during the Civil War. The 1870 census told us that as a free man, Gilbert owned property, sent his kids to school, and lived up on High Street. Isaac Gilbert's story is just one that we are including in the new African American history exhibit, Black Voices from Harpers Ferry. Black history is one of the 4 themes that makes Harpers Ferry a National Historical Park. Of course, Black history plays a big role in the other 3 themes. We interpret the United States Armory in the Industrial Revolution, John Brown's raid, and the Civil War. The African American theme also claims attention with Storer College. This predominantly black school operated from the end of the Civil War until 1955. The park already has several exhibits on Storer and is currently planning to open up more. Starting in 1989, Harpers Ferry National Historical Park began an extensive and ongoing research project to discover more about all aspects of African Americans and their contributions. We met with the local community, researched census records, United States Armory records, newspapers, public records, and of course we studied the secondary literature. We found a lot. We're already using new information in programs, we've done training on a national level, we've set up temporary exhibits, but the biggest payoff is this new permanent exhibit. Slavery is an uncomfortable subject. It's funny though. Once visitors get past the stereotypes and begin to understand the workings of slavery and the slaves themselves, they're fascinated. The subject provokes them, and sometimes they're moved. The exhibit uses an electric map, graphics, and text to describe the demographics of pre-Civil War Harpers Ferry. We also describe the work of African Americans and show where they lived. Many visitors are surprised when they discover that in the days of slavery, most buildings in town had blacks and whites living under the same roof. The stories of individuals seems most effective in provoking a deeper understanding of the effects of slavery. We placed audio stations that tell these stories throughout the exhibit. They give visitors the opportunity to take in information in an intimate way and then reflect. The audio tape that presents Isaac Gilbert introduces the reality that human beings were considered to be property. We've also displayed local deeds of trust that stipulate slaves as collateral on loans, government documents that identify slaves rented by the United States Armory, as well as slave insurance policies. Reproduction newspaper advertisements describe the sale of slaves. Advertisements also communicate the common practice of renting slaves. Lots of African Americans were hired out on a yearly basis. The owners wrote contracts spelling out the clothing and care their rented slaves would receive. Anne was rented by Nicholas Marmion in 1851. We have the contract that describes her clothing, and we reproduced it. What her year in the Marmion house was like, none of us know. Still, we do know that sales, financial failures, and the possibility of being hired out must have made a slave's life pretty uncertain. Families could be split, relationships shattered, and loved ones lost. Not surprisingly, our research also discovered physical hardships. The exhibit presents this testimony of an 1854 divorce proceeding. On one occasion, Mr. Alexander came into the house and said that he had taken that rainy day for whipping and had been the rounds at the barn and said, "I think I love to whip." One of the Negro boys, who was very severely whipped that day, ran off. The house where this occurred still stands. Mrs. Alexander got her divorce, but Mr. Alexander faced no consequences for the treatment of his slaves. It's important that visitors understand slavery in a national context. This exhibit doesn't address the many different ways slavery worked in the various regions of the South. However, with the description of the 1857 Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court, the exhibit does imply that regardless of their particular circumstances, slaves were always legal property and had to contend with the whims and desires of their owners. The Dred Scott case reaffirmed this. To be a slave was to be treated as a thing. Obviously, slaves were not things. Isaac Gilbert is an example of the many blacks who learned to manipulate people who had power. We devoted a whole section of the exhibit to African Americans' resistance. Many slaves ran away. Lots of slaves came through Harpers Ferry as they attempted to escape. This slave, Emmanuel, had traveled through Harpers Ferry before. He was a boatman and carried goods from the Shenandoah River to Georgetown. Emmanuel must have known that he could pass through Harpers Ferry again without being noticed. The ad describes him as 6 feet tall and about 35 years old. We reproduced his clothing and expect visitors to handle the garments. We don't know if Emmanuel got away, but we hope the clothing will evoke empathy. Harpers Ferry was also attractive to runaways because the large free black population sometimes helped slaves get north. An audio station tells the story of Joseph Blanham. Blanham was a free black boatman who was convicted in 1844 for helping slaves escape. White townspeople became so concerned about runaways that they met and endorsed the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Most of all, white society in Harpers Ferry was afraid of slave revolt. We've included an account of Nat Turner's rebellion to show that a current of fear flowed under day-to-day life.